Pleasure to be here. It would really help me to find out a little bit about you and just a couple of questions. How many of you have been involved in clinical trials? About half the room. And how many of you have been involved in clinical trials for more than 5 years? Much fewer number, but still good. And how many of you have worked on a clinical trial where nothing has gone wrong? Neither have I, so you're not alone. I've had the good fortune of working in a lot of different clinical trial environments. I started out working in a hospital, doing clinical trials for industry or for investigators, and then moved into industry and worked both at small and large medical device companies, and then have actually now worked in consulting and helping those companies try and move their products to market and helping them identify the clinical regulatory path that is needed. So there's never the same answer for everything, and there's probably more pitfalls than, number of people here in the room. What I'd like to do now is just to talk about some key ones that I've run into. Definitely not an exhaustive list, definitely doesn't have all the answers for mitigation, but I think it would be helpful, because we have this broken down into sections, that I stop and ask if anybody has had, a good pitfall, and how did they either try and get out of it, or how did they try to even prevent it from happening. So I'll let you ask questions throughout the course of the next half hour, and hopefully we'll all learn a little bit more. So what really would make a clinical study execution less risky? I'm sure you all ask yourselves that every day. It really comes down to, have you asked the right questions? And considering nobody's laughing, I'm assuming you can't really figure this out. But this is a house, actually, where the cliff below it just gave way. And it's not photoshopped, I can tell you that. But indeed, somebody forgot to ask the right question. There are so many moving parts and so many decisions to be made in a clinical trial. That's why you can never really catch all of the pitfalls or prevent all of the pitfalls. However, if we can just kind of use this method, if you will, to think about what are the common things, why do they happen, and how can we hopefully not trip into them again. I think we're all very familiar with this particular diagram, and it's tried and true. Every decision you're going to make is going to have to take into consideration the amount of time it's going to take, the cost that it's going to incur, and the scope or the quality that has to be considered. And no clinical trial can be done by one person. It has to be a cross-functional project team with a strong leader that works to have their team trained for this particular product and this particular trial, and that uses good communication. And I think we can all think of pitfalls when the team doesn't communicate and how it strays off the path. And if I can give you a word of advice, please let the team work at identifying the risks of that particular study and how to manage those risks, because they are more likely, being in the trenches, going to come up with those ideas. It's not going to necessarily come from somebody sitting in a room. Let's start out with resource allocation. I think that We all know we need resources. We all see it as a very costly endeavor. And it always seems we never have enough people, nor do we have necessarily the right people. And what is it that, you know, we missed along the way if you found yourself in this situation? Well, a lot of times it's just that you didn't get the right person with the right skill set. I can't stress enough that when you are actually hiring people, that you really do have a good sense of what you want that person to be responsible for, and do a thorough evaluation of that. I think we've all been in situations where somebody says, oh, my friend can do that, and we didn't dig deep enough, and maybe the friend really didn't work out. And I think as we go through some of these pitfalls and why it happens, I'm referring to this not so much in a negative way, but in a way to be a learning tool, if you will. So please don't take anything personally, because I've done these pitfalls too. Okay? Then some other things you might think about when you are staffing up to do clinical trials is the complement of in-house versus out-of-house folks that you can use, particularly when you're doing OUS work. There are certainly a number of qualified vendors and CROs in other countries that can help you navigate those particular clinical trial requirements and make your life easier and help the trials go smoother. Trial design is extremely exciting because everybody has a good idea, right? A couple of the more common pitfalls that we see are trials that are too large. And if any of you are the CEOs or the CFOs or part of your senior management team, I'm sure the first thing you say to your team is how to get that smaller, right? So I can't stress enough finding the right statisticians to work with, the right critical trial design thinkers to help come up with those particular trial designs that can actually help you minimize the number of patients that you're going to need to put into that trial. Also, you really need to give thought to those endpoints that you're going to be using for your trial. I've seen studies being done with very broad endpoints that the trial could never collect the right data for. But if they had narrowed it down a little bit, they would have been easily realizing their final endpoint, and it would have helped them in their approval process. Some other things about trial designs that you can think about in order to optimize the design itself is what type of trial do you need for the particular phase of the study that you're in. Again, feasibility trials typically have been done outside of the US, but there is an interest by the FDA to do more trials in the US. Takes a little bit of strategy and thinking about how to get that done. But again, OUS is a very comfortable way to actually get a study done. And there are a lot of countries that actually are set up for doing this because so many, particularly first-in-man trials, are done outside of the US. You certainly want to simplify your trials by doing single arms if you can. And again, typically feasibility trials are single arms, and they have a very simple analysis plan. You don't have to start to get fancy, if you will. Pivotal trials, which are going to actually support your endpoints, are going to be obviously more robust because you're looking at safety and effectiveness. But again, this is now a very interesting part of the entire trial design package, because there are more opportunities to use what's known as adaptive trial designs. And I'm just curious, how many of you are familiar with that aspect of designing trials and using new ways to do it? Besides my colleague who does this all the time. Okay. So if you are going to be in a situation where you're going to be looking to do trial designs, I would encourage you strongly to find those statisticians, those trial design experts that have been able to come up with new and innovative ways to do a trial, and not your, if you will, in a typical fashion, because it can actually bring down your sample size, bring down the time it takes to do the clinical trial, and also reduce your costs. Just as a little aside, I'm working with a company, and they actually came up with a great adaptive trial design for a very difficult patient population and a disease state that they were trying to work in. And they took it to the FDA, had everything worked out, and it was the FDA that got cold feet. So unfortunately, they had to switch over to a more traditional trial design, and instead of having a 275 patient trial, they had to go to a 500 patient trial. So you can see the range of savings that you could have with a trial like that. Okay. Also, just to mention regarding the trial designs, we're very familiar with doing, early trials called feasibility trials, where you do a few patients, look at the results, you design your larger trial, your pivotal trial that is going to get your product approved, and then almost every trial now has to have some sort of a post-market trial associated with it. Just to draw your attention to a recent guidance that came out from the FDA, in which they're encouraging staging trials, and will actually let you get into the trial, which maybe we would consider the pivotal, because all of that data is going to be used for approval of that product. You can get into the trial early on while you're still working through some questions to be answered with the FDA, which again cuts down the amount of time that you're spending on that trial and allows you to use that early data with the larger cohort of data for the final data analysis to support your trial. So let's talk a little bit about the execution of a clinical trial. The first block over there on the right, I purposely italicized the word surprisingly, because as much planning as goes into starting a clinical trial, when enrollment is not what everybody expected, everybody's really surprised. And I think that we're hesitant to really look at the practical aspects of enrolling patients into trials. And some of it comes down to, have you picked the right sites? Have you picked the right investigators? Do the physician practices and patient population actually support doing those that particular clinical trial? So you need to actually go through a rigorous process of qualifying sites, and you have to be honest with yourself and with that site that if they don't really meet your qualifications, that it would not be a win-win if they were to actually be part of that trial, and you don't want anybody to experience failure. So be as rigorous as you can with identification of those sites, because it will pay off in the end when good sites put in patients and your trial can be enrolled on time. There's also times when data, as it's being reviewed, and sometimes unfortunately at the end, that the data has been questionable. And the reason for that happening is that nobody was paying attention or enough attention to the site as far as making sure that the data was collected correctly and that the site actually knew as much as they needed to about doing the particular trial. So training is especially important, and you need to have engagement with the site throughout the trial. You can't give them the tools and then walk away. You need to actually keep that relationship going so that if they have questions or if you're seeing something, you've built up a relationship so that you can go to them, they can come to you, and you can talk through what those problems might be. One thing we find helpful is being able to collect metrics throughout the study, and I'll give you some examples of that in the next slide. But collecting the metrics and taking a look at that on a consistent basis helps the team to identify where they need to work with sites a little bit more frequently, and it also helps keep you on track for making sure that your team is doing as much as it can in helping these sites. The other common pitfall in executing sites are hiring, contracting with vendors, and of course everybody has good intentions, and please don't get me wrong, but somehow the vendor did not meet the expectations for that particular study. So I can't stress enough the fact that auditing a particular vendor before you contract with them is extremely important, and you need to have an audit that is performed by a person who knows that particular space. And I'm going to give you a very poignant example of this. Again, recently working with a client, they felt they had the in-house experience to actually go to this particular laboratory, audit them, and felt that they passed, and we started up a very complicated trial. The trial itself had its endpoint based on all of the information coming out of this laboratory. As part of our process in managing the data, we started reconciling the data coming from that lab with other pieces of data we were collecting. And there were some things that were just not making sense. When we went back independently from the client, clearly with their knowledge, and started asking some questions, it became very apparent that the processes the client thought the vendor had in place were not in place. They were not closely managing that vendor, and now we have to deal with data that is suspect, and nobody wants to be in that particular situation. So if I can send you away with one piece of information, it's make sure you know who your partners are and be robust about it. Okay? I mentioned that metrics are an excellent way to monitor a trial, and you start this at the beginning of the trial, and you're going to do this continuously until the trial ends. Some of the metrics, if I can, oh yeah, it works. Some of the metrics that we like to look at is to And we deliver this to the clients so that things are as transparent as possible. Just some of the basics about the trial, what it's all about, who's working on it, and kind of a quick shot in time, where we are with enrollment. And then we have our timeline and our deliverables listed out. So again, everybody can monitor where we are with the study. I'm sorry this is so small. I apologize for that, but I think it's more the visual than the actual pieces of information in here. But some of the other information you can do is to look at enrollment rates, what's predicted versus what's actual. You can look at clinical sites to tell how well their enrollment is and who is at the head of the pack. And then you're starting to look at compliance in the protocol. One very good compliance measure is how many protocol deviations might a site have. How many times are they not following the protocol, or perhaps their patients are not following the protocol, which is a red flag then for you to go out and double check what's going on at that site. And it could be something as simple as nobody's understanding a question, so they're answering it wrong on the case report forms. And then finally, you can also actually track how well the case report forms are being completed. Are they on time? Do you have a lot of questions out to the site, data queries? And this helps you in managing, again, not only the site so that they remain compliant, but to work with your monitors to get out there and keep the data clean, because the next analysis is coming around the corner, and you don't want to hold up an analysis. Along with trial execution, I think of it on two sides of the fence. One is, what is the responsibility of the client who needs to get the trial done, and what do they need to think about, and then what are the clinical sites doing or not doing that you have to manage. Some of those common pitfalls is that, again, data is not accurate or available, and it's discovered too late. Again, situation is that monitoring was not used enough at that particular site or in that particular study, and then you may not have been watching the queries of cleaning the data, and now you're coming to the end of the study and somebody opens the door to the database and there is so much work to do at the end. Now you're spending too much time and too many dollars on actually trying to play catch up. So again, you can plan for some of this ahead of time by getting your various plans in place, which includes your monitoring plan. The other common pitfall at a site is that they really are unable to meet the needs. And this goes back to site qualifications. Just two simple things, but it really threw a wrench into a couple of studies. Again, they were studies planned to do outside of the US. Oh, we talked to the physicians there, everything sounds good. The qualifications list was not comprehensive enough, and after contracts were signed, the client only found out then that the hospital had no internet access. And we were dependent on that for how we were collecting data. Something very simple, but look at how much time and effort and money was spent just to kind of hit a wall. Another interesting thing is we had a client who had a particular part of a device for hemodialysis. and we needed to run a study, very small, probably going to be at one site. We talked to the physician, we did the site qualification, and when it came right down to it, that part that was under investigation could not be used at that site because they didn't have the right equipment at that site. So again, time, effort, money that was wasted if the right questions had been asked. Data management, again, so many things to talk about, but sometimes not enough thought goes into early on exactly what data has to be collected versus nice to have. And as we know, every data point needs to be cleaned, if you will. And sometimes we get so excited about a trial and about treating a patient with a new device that we actually over-collect the data. So I would encourage you to work closely with your data management team to actually keep down the amount of data points that you want to collect so that, again, you're saving time both for your clinical sites. They don't have to put as much energy and effort into it, and they'll like you for that. With your data management team, they won't have as much to clean, and then with your monitoring team, because they won't have as much to monitor. And then also know what kind of database you really do need, because we found too often that clients have thought the database was going to be able to provide them the type of support that they needed, invested in that, and then comes to find out we could not get the type of data out of the database that they had chosen. Just as a, again, a little side story, we were working with a client. We have our own database. And as we were setting it up, for those of you who know databases, whether they're clinical or not, you go through a certain amount of user acceptance testing and validation. And we were actually at the very end of doing all of that work, ready to put data in. And the client decided they wanted their own in-house database and started from scratch and basically recreated the wheel with a programmer who had never worked on a clinical database before. Those of you familiar with clinical databases know that they're very complex. There is a lot of crosstalk between not only data fields, but pages within a patient's data file. And it took them a year to actually bring that database up to the point that we can now use it. They, just to give them credit, they had their reasons for bringing in an in-house database, but could not believe how long it took doing it themselves. So again, if you're thinking about time and effort and money, you want to not recreate the wheel, but utilize what's available to you in order to get going as quickly as possible, and working with those who basically have done it before. Data analysis, just one thing that you should definitely do for every project, and that is to prepare a statistical analysis plan with your statistician and also with people cross-functionally, because everybody looks at an analysis a little bit different. But having that analysis plan done at the beginning of the study, and all of the data tables that you're going to need and will depend on when you're preparing your reports and your submissions to the FDA, it becomes very important that you've thought through as many of the possibilities for analysis upfront as opposed to thinking about them too late and taking more time to reprogram the database to do the analysis. One thing on report generation, again, I think this is an area we don't give enough thought to up front in the study. And for those of you who have seen a product through its paces, there are reports that you need to give to the FDA on an annual basis. There are reports you need for your data monitoring committee. There are reports that you need to give to IRBs there, and certainly the final submission reports. Many of the same analyses can be used between the different reports, and if you, again, spend the time to think this through, you can include all of that in your statistical analysis plan and have that already pre-programmed, so when you're down to the last wire of getting a report out, it's much easier to get the data out of the database. I'll let you read a lot of the information here. Please keep in mind that safety committees are a very integral part of your studies, and there, again, are ways to try and keep down the costs in managing these committees and in using them to actually keep your study on track. We've talked about many of our lessons, or the lessons that I've learned along the way. I hope this has given you some idea of how to better set up and execute your studies. And we thank you very much for this opportunity of talking with you. Thank you.